I'm in the village of Queenston in the Niagara region, and this house is the home of James and Laura Secord. And if you remember your grade 10 history, Laura Secord in June of 1813 walked over 19 miles to the DeCrew house to warn Lieutenant James FitzGibbon of an impending American attack on his position. In early 1813, American forces had captured the Niagara region, and this town of Queenston is in the middle of that region, right on the Niagara River. It had seen a lot of heavy fighting in October of 1813, where Major General Isaac Brock was killed just over that way. But the Secords lived here. James was in the militia, and he had been wounded. American forces had occupied the town and the homestead, and this was where Laura Secord learned that they were preparing an attack on FitzGibbon's position at the DeCrew house. Now, the DeCrew house was being used as a forward observation point. The British had been slowly pushing the Americans back to the Niagara region, and they had set up a series of what we might call forward observation points around the Niagara region. The DeCrew house had been one of them. But FitzGibbon was a bit of a pain in the ass, because he had carried out a number of raids and attacks against American patrols and American forward positions. And apart from his garrison of 50 men, he also had a large number of First Nations warriors from the Six Nations Reserve near present-day Brantford, as well as a large contingent of warriors from the Seven Nations in Quebec, Canada, just south of Montreal. And they were rather interesting because they were commanded by an Indian Department officer who was bilingual. He spoke French and Mohawk. Laura Secord, when she learned of the plans, she walked to the DeCrew house to warn FitzGibbon. But FitzGibbon probably already knew of the attack was coming because the American forces had been forming up. And his job as at a forward observation point was to keep an eye on American forces and their movements in the area. Plus, the British also had a number of other observation points manned by local militia or regular British forces. So when Laura Secord got to the DeCrew house, she warned FitzGibbon, and this allowed FitzGibbon time to set up his battle plan, which culminated in the Battle of Beaver's Dams, which he won, though he was heavily outnumbered. But I gotta tell you, he won mostly by bluff. Quite successfully, I might add. It's an interesting little point, but in order to connect the dots, we should go to the DeCrew house, which is that way. Pretty cool. Anyway, let's get back in the car and go find the DeCrew house and Lieutenant James FitzGibbon's forward position. This ruin behind me is the remains of the DeCrew house. And it was this house in June of 1813 that the British Army was using as a forward observation post. Now, it was one of many observation posts that the British were using that surrounded the Niagara Peninsula, all to keep an eye on the Americans and to interfere with their patrols that they were running out of Fort George. And it was this position that the Americans were planning on attacking in June and bringing word to FitzGibbon was Laura Secord. And this house was her destination. And the Secord house is 19 miles that way. Sorry, I don't know what that is in kilometers, but I'll figure it out. The person in command of British forces here was Lieutenant James FitzGibbon, and his job was to keep an eye on the Americans, also to interfere with their patrols. He had a garrison of 50 men, all regulars from the 49th of Foot. He also had a large party of First Nations warriors from the Six Nations Reserve at Brantford, and he also had a large number of warriors from the Seven Nations in Quebec under the command of an Indian Department officer who, as I said earlier, spoke French and Mohawk and no English. FitzGibbon probably already knew that the Americans were coming to attack his position. This was one of many observation posts. It's on top of the Niagara Escarpment, so they could have kept an eye on anything moving through the Niagara region. Laura Secord simply would have confirmed information that he already knew and had. This is rather cool. It's unfortunate that the house is burned down. There's a plaque here. This house of Captain John Decrew, the name and various spellings of the relative descendants, was headquarters of British outpost under Lieutenant James FitzGibbon, to which came Laura Secord. This area below the escarpment was pretty swampy. Decrew was a militia officer. He'd fought at Fort George in May of 1813. His wife and children lived here throughout the entire time. And John Decrew was a prisoner of war until 1814. He was present at Lundy's Lane. He did escape his captivity. He was at Lundy's Lane. And he would have been in the Lincoln Militia. This is really cool. But this ruin is the location that Laura Secord was walking to when she found out the Americans were going to attack it. And as I said, when FitzGibbon attacked the Americans, which led to the Battle of Beaver Dam, he was heavily outnumbered, and he mostly won that battle by bluff. Because the Americans outnumbered him, but the unit that attacked him was mostly made up of New York militia. They'd grown up on stories of First Nations atrocities during the American Revolutionary War. These weren't people from Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, who First Nations didn't mean a whole lot to them. So when FitzGibbon demanded their surrender, he sold it to them that he was saving their lives to keep them from being massacred. And they fell for it. This is a really pretty place. And this is the back of the Decrew house. This all would have been clear cut back in the day. Quite a large house. Probably quite a large property. And if the guy was a captain in the Lincoln Militia who owned it, yeah, I can see why. Ontario is full of places like this that tell interesting stories about interesting people. Some of those stories are about everyday folks like the Decrew family, and others are like Laura Secord, who becomes a hero. You should check out the stories in your area. Just remember, when you're wandering around looking for interesting stories or just going for a walk, keep walking with a camera. Until next time, cheers. So what do you think, Rupert? What other stories do you think you want to go looking for? Great traveling companion.